Have you ever felt like something was watching you when the whole world was supposed to be asleep? My name is Daniel Ortiz. I live in Albuquerque, and for years I pulled the night shift at different jobs, until that handful of nights taught me there are things you cannot explain away with coffee or logic. I am a former gas station attendant, a part-time taxi driver, and for a spell a security guard at a small community hospital I used to pass on my route, and I still work nights sometimes to keep the bills balanced. The first story I am about to tell happened at a corner station with 4 pumps under a halo of sodium lights. The second inside a quiet emergency corridor where the fluorescent hum never quit. And the third in a cab that made me lock the doors even when a fare sat back there. I did not believe in ghosts or curses or whatever name you want to give the code that walks. No, I did not, until the nights themselves convinced me in details so small and so stubborn that denial was impassable. Picture a single car with its headlights on parked at pump 3, with no driver in the seat, breath fogging the glass, a radio crackle that was not coming from any device, and then a series of knocks on the metal locker that matched my own heartbeat. I wrote everything down in a small duty log that I kept in a packet, because at the time I thought I was just building a strange story for myself and maybe a laugh with coworkers later. The camera footage would tell a different story. I will tell you each night exactly as I felt it, every sound that surprised me, every person who either saw the same thing or told me they had felt it before, and the proof I tried to collect with shaky hands and a flashlight that vibrated in my grip. I grew up 13 blocks from the station in a row house that smelled like frying oil and old hymnals, the kind of home where work was never a question and leaving was a fantasy you only read about in the back of magazines. My father fixed cars and my mother stitched uniforms for the local nursing staff, and when I was 12, I learned how to change a tire and how to hold my breath while the radio announced rain. Those childhood trades taught me patience and worry, and later, when I joined night work, it felt like a continuation of those quiet trades. I had training certificates from a community college, a faded EMT course I never used, and a line of small jobs that paid the rent but not the peace. I married once young for reasons that I told myself were noble and practical, and 4 years into that marriage, my wife Rosa left with our daughter for a job across. That loss left me with a kind of hollow steadiness, the kind that makes you choose nights because there are fewer faces to answer to. After that, my habits hardened. I kept a small silver locket my mother gave me because it felt like an anchor on those long commutes. My best friend from childhood, Mike, sometimes covered shifts. My neighbor Carlos lent me tools, and my boss Linda scheduled me for double nights when someone called in sick. The backstory matters because it explains why I was alone so often and why I listened to sounds more carefully than others might. I am not reckless and I am not dramatic by nature. I learned to be wary of my imagination because it was the source of so many evenings of worry. That is why each sensory detail in what I tell you matters to me more than any lecture about coincidence. The smell of diesel seeped into my clothes. The neon sign buzzed like a swarm of insects. The floor tiles of the gas station had a tacky shine in the sodium glow. And the first time I heard that hollow knock, I thought it was a loose pipe or a raccoon. When you have worked nights long enough, you develop a list of rational explanations, and you run each new sound through it before you accept the possibility it is something else. I had that list. I used it, and every time the list failed, I wrote it down and kept a photograph with the note so I could not forget how many plausible excuses vanished under the weight of what I saw. The first sign came as a small, impossible thing, and I remember the exact temperature, the way moisture beaded at the corner of my eyes because of the cold light, and how the radio on the counter kept returning to a soft static that hummed under any station I tuned to. It was 20 past 2, and the pumps were empty but for a dark sedan at pump 3. I stepped out with a flashlight and my boots made small wet sounds on the pavement. I called out, "Hey," to see if someone needed help. The car window was fogged from the inside as if someone had just been there, and the seatbelt was not buckled. I circled the vehicle slowly, flashlight beam on the chrome trim, and the beam caught nothing in the seat. I rapped on the driver's side and then on the glass. I remember the smell of gasoline sharper in the cold air. a sharp metallic edge to it, and the taste of it in the back of my throat when the wind shifted. I opened the passenger door and found only a folded jacket on the seat, like someone had stepped away for a moment. I checked the trunk and the glove compartment. No wallet, no phone, no bag. The license plate matched a car I knew from down the street, a neighbor of my boss named Marco, who sometimes came in to buy chips. I walked back to the counter and switched on the CCTV monitor. The camera feed was grainy and slowed in a way that made everything look like a dream. I rewound 18 minutes and watched the headlights roll into frame and park, then nothing. No figure stepped out, no shadow reached the door. The light of the car was there, and then it stayed, as if a presence sat in the glow with no body to account for it. When I replayed that clip in slow motion, a low-frequency sound appeared on the audio track, a static that rode the edges of the recording like a moth at a lamp. I called Marco on his phone because I thought maybe he had stepped out to smoke, but the number went to voicemail. I left a voice message. "Lo siento for waking him," I said, and hung up. Later, Mike showed up to relieve me, and when he watched the footage, his face did not look surprised. It looked like he had been waiting for a proof that his own late nights had hinted at. We argued about logical explanations in a series of exchanges full of clipped sentences that kept returning to the same 2 points. Was there fog inside the glass? And did anyone step out and leave the car? I remember Mike saying, "Watch the timestamps," and I said, "Look at the radio frequency interference." And we both reached for different reasons to explain it. We had a 6 exchange back and forth that night that doubled as an attempt to calm ourselves. The station log recorded no sale at Pump 3 that hour, and yet the car remained through dawn until the cleaning crew took it away. That small, impossible tableau multiplied. Nights passed with small anomalies. Tools I left in the storage room moved overnight. The fluorescence above the counter would flicker in patterns that looked like Morse code if you stared long enough. A pair of sneakers I kept by the doorway ended up lined under the shelving like someone set them down politely. The next week, Linda found footprints in the dust by the closed door, as if someone had stood and listened. I started writing down each oddity in the duty log and adding sensory notes. A scene that stands out so vividly, I replay it like a dream, involved a man in a blue jacket who I swore I saw at the far pump and then was not when I approached. The jacket hung on the seat of the car, but no one sat in the driver's seat, and the jacket smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and coffee grounds. I opened the cash drawer after that, and coins rattled out in a pile as if a hand had tipped them without touching anything. The radio static became a leitmotif, a soft hiss that would swell into a whisper of syllables just beyond comprehension, and then recede. I called my neighbor Carlos because he kept rabbits in the alley, and I thought maybe an animal was the cause. Carlos came over, and he paced the pumps with a lantern, eyes narrowing, nostrils flaring as he tried to place the smell of fuel. He touched the hood of the car and said it was colder than the air, his voice small and factual. He is a practical man, and for him to say the metal felt wrong meant something. The station cameras were checked and rechecked. Don Ernesto, the tech who handles CCTV for the small chain, came down one night with a kit and a seriousness I had not seen before. He ran his hands through files, lifted the recorder, and said the timestamps looked sewn, like frames had been inserted or erased. He was careful with words and used procedural details I did not fully understand, but that sounded official. He said he would bring the recorder to the municipal office and have someone look at it. Later he called me back and left a short message. "Do not delete that file," he said, and then static. Don Ernesto is one of the first named secondary witnesses in my story, and he later gave a short verbal report that matched what I wrote in the log. That pattern of called-in help and then uneasy silences continued. My boss Linda scolded me mildly for letting the pump be unattended, and then her voice lowered when I showed her the footage. She said maybe we should close early, and maybe we should not, and then she left for home and a light in the back blinked as if to punctuate a sentence we were not ready to complete. Around this point, I want to pause and ask you to join the conversation. I will read some comments at the end, and your voice matters here, because nights like these are not unique to me. If you are watching and you remember a shift where the walls breathed or an engine idled with no driver, you are not alone. If you have a short story, begin it with "in my shift" and tell one sentence with where it was and what the sound felt like. Type "in my shift, New Mexico parking lot" or "in my shift, hospital corridor" and say whether you felt watched or touched. Do not worry about grammar, just share the detail that stays with you. I will read as many as I can, and sometimes I will feature a small selection in a future episode. When 3 or 4 of you tell the same subtle detail, like a specific pattern of knocks or a radio hiss, we start to have something closer to evidence than anecdote. This channel exists because people who work nights tend to keep quiet, and that silence helps the strange continue unseen. So if you have "in my shift" of a night that did not make sense, type it now and start with "in my shift" so we can find each other. Thank you for that. And now keep reading, because what happens next is the part that made me change jobs for months and then returned, because I had to know whether whatever this was would follow me. The escalation continued across 3 distinct episodes that I will describe in detail, because each one peels away a different kind of denial. The first escalation involved a direct communication that was not spoken but was unmistakable. One night, Mike was working with me, and we had a 12-exchange argument about whether to lock the back door. When the radio went into static, and then into a voice that seemed to say, "Daniel." Mike laughed nervously and said, "Did you hear that?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Yes." And we both faced the counter like a pair of kids who had seen too many late-night films. The lights dimmed, and a pressure hung in the air like someone had exhaled close by. I opened the register and found a slip of paper tucked under a roll of tape. On it was written in a shaky block script, "Leave it alone." I remember the scratch of the pen as if it had pressed through to the next page, because the indentation sat deeply in the cardboard. We argued about whether to treat it as a joke and who in the neighborhood would prank a lone gas station, but the handwriting matched nothing we knew. I called my ex-wife Rosa because she lives near enough to the station to be credible, and she came down with a thermos of coffee and a skeptical face. Rosa has a knack for cutting through fear with practical questions. She pushed the paper into the camera until the grain swallowed the letters and said, "If someone wanted to scare you, they could have just written a note and not left their car with headlights on." She was right and wrong at the same time, because the car remained through dawn. The exchanges that night between us became longer as we tried to rationalize, and included 8 to 10 quick quips that mixed fear and humor, and the kind of banter only old friends use when the situation grows heavy. A regular customer named Linda later told me she had sometimes seen cars parked and drivers who vanished into the night, and that the neighborhood has always had rumors of a road that forgets people. Linda had drinks at the counter, and she pressed the edge of the napkin into my hand as she told me this. Her presence was a small anchor. The second escalation happened in the hospital where I worked a night stint as a security guard. The hospital was old, with a linoleum pattern that never masked the dull scuff of night shoes and a corridor that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and fried food from the vending machine. It was during a slow graveyard shift when the night nurse Sarah called me because she heard a chair scrape in a locked supply room. We both walked down the same corridor that hummed with the steady beep of a distant monitor. The hallway light flickered, and the intercom buzzed out a piece of static that resolved into a laugh that did not belong to any human register. Sarah clutched her keys and said, "Maybe it's a patient with dementia." And I said, "Maybe it's ventilation turning or a delivery." And she said, "No, this is different." And then we heard it again, a single low laugh and a knock on the door. We spoke in low sentences that tried to stay sensible. "Do you want me to call maintenance?" "Yes, do that now." "No, wait." And then the door opened on its own. Inside, a wheelchair faced the corner, and a folded blanket lay as if someone had used it recently. There were no wheel tracks in the dusty supply closet line. Nurse Sarah cried later when we talked quietly in the break room. She said she had been a nurse for 15 years, and this made her skin crawl. We called the hospital chaplain, Father Miguel, who came over with a small candle and a calm voice. He walked in and said in a measured tone, "Sometimes places carry the memory of things, and sometimes they make noise to be noticed." He recorded nothing definitive, but his presence mattered for the hospital records. We wrote a formal incident report with names and times, and a maintenance man named Hector came the next morning and said the door hinges were fine. The official protocol was followed and recorded in a report that took up 3 pages of typed text with signatures. The sequence of exchanges that night between Sarah, myself, the chaplain, and maintenance were long and thorough, 8 to 10 moves in each thread as we tried to produce a shred of ordinary cause. The third escalation reached me inside my cab, and it is the one that forced me to sleep with a lamp on for months. Late one winter night, I took a fare who asked to be driven to the east side near a small cemetery. I remember the touch of his hand on the seat as he settled in, and the smell of linoleum and cheap cologne. He did not give me a MAME, and he asked me to drive slow. The street lights were few, and the road smelled of melted snow and brake fluid. He was quiet for a long time, and then said, "Tell me something true." And I thought he was being philosophical, and I told him the truth, that I worked nights because daytime felt too loud. He laughed softly, and then the radio sputtered into the same static I had been hearing at the station, and in the hospital. The static formed a pattern, and then a whisper said, "You will not leave." I asked him what he said, and he frowned and told me, "I am tired. Please stop the car." I pulled over because I thought he was sick, and he slid into the back with a stiffness that made me worry. I reached to unlock the door, and my hand hit a cold that ran up the forearm, and the passenger murmured, "Thank you, Daniel." I froze because his voice said my name, and I had not told him yet. We traded questions that night. "Are you okay?" he asked, and I said yes, and he said, "You will see me again," and I said, "No, I will not," and he smiled like someone who already knew the answer. He had no identification in his wallet when I checked later, and the cab meter had not run since he slid into the back. I called my dispatcher, Marco, who laughed at first and said, "Are you falling asleep at the wheel?" And I told him no, and he listened as I described the voice, and then he said, "Hold on, I will put a patch on his record," and he sounded worried. The more I tried to explain, the more the room in the back of the cab felt like ice. I drove him to the edge of the cemetery and stopped. He thanked me and stepped out and walked between the gravestones as if he had always belonged there. I watched until he dissolved into a gap in the fog, and then I drove away while the static on the radio hummed like a reminder. Marco later told me another driver had reported a similar fare weeks earlier, and we added the story to a small list of odd rides. We argued with each other over the radio in a sequence that swayed between exasperation and concern for nearly 10 exchanges, and in each call my voice tightened and then loosened like something breathing. After that night, I refused to pick up street fares near that cemetery for months. Each of these escalations reached a moment of direct confrontation that made me physically feel the presence in ways that logic could not absorb. At the gas station, I walked out to check the pumps and heard a single knock from inside the storage shed. I whispered, "Who is there?" And the answer was a pattern of knocks that matched the rhythm of my own name. I called out, "Marco?" and "Mike?" and the knock stopped and then resumed, like someone listening for my next syllable. The dialogue that night between me and whatever answered was made up of short calls and returns, and in total there were 9 exchanges where I asked if someone was joking, and then the sound answered with 3 precise taps each time, as if to mimic my pulse. At the hospital, I opened the supply closet, and the chair creaked, and the chair then seemed to roll toward me when no human hand had moved it. I said, "Who is there?" And a voice replied in the same timbre I knew from the radio, "It will be one of you." And the shock was so immediate I could not move. I pushed past, and the chair scraped, but nobody was in the room. And the blanket had a circle of dust like a body had rested there. My hand shook, and the conversation in my head ran back and forth like a list of possible mechanical failures and religious consolations. In the cab, the passenger said things about the future I did not want to hear, and the smell in the car turned to cold soot and river mud, and then to the scent of violets and decaying paper. Each confrontation came with a set of 8 to 10 verbal exchanges between me and other humans as we processed and then tried to file the event under something reasonable. Those long exchanges are the skeleton of how the community reacted. Names like Linda, Mike, Rosa, Marco, Don Ernesto, Sarah, Father Miguel, Hector, and Carlos recur because people did not want to be anonymous in these moments, and because each one left a small mark. Right after the most intense encounters, I always tried to do something practical because action postpones the worst of the fear. I called my boss Linda to report the event at the station, and she advised we close the pump. I called the hospital shift manager when the chair moved, and they told me to file an incident report and to keep doors locked. I called the police when the man stepped from the cemetery, and they sent Officer Ramirez, who took notes and said he would check the area cameras. At each step, there was a procedural cadence that both comforted and frustrated me. The technical descriptions that followed are important because they show we sought evidence in official ways. For the CCTV analysis, Don Ernesto removed the DVR unit and checked for tampering, then created a forensic copy on a sealed drive and labeled the time codes. That process involved writing an evidence log, calculating frame rates, and exporting raw files to a municipal lab. The steps took 3 hours and were recorded with signatures to ensure chain of custody. For the hospital incident, the maintenance team documented door hinges, measured decibel levels in the corridor, and logged motion sensor data that showed no ordinary human movement at the times in question. That procedure required tagging each sensor, resetting baselines, and then cross-referencing with staff keycard access logs. Those process descriptions are factual, and they helped us avoid the embarrassment of being dismissed as alarmists. The police report lists names and times and remarks on nothing found yet, and Officer Ramirez took those notes with a clinical tone and later delivered a brief oral summary that he filed with the coroner. Station. The records exist because people who work nights depend on paperwork to make the noise into something the daylight world can parse. Despite the procedures, some things refuse to be contained. A week after the cab incident, I woke to a voicemail from an unknown number. It was 2 seconds long, and when I played it, the audio was raw. Static, followed by a breath, and the whisper, "Daniel," and then more static. My heart dropped, and then I listened to the digital file on my laptop because the human habit is to extract meaning from small things. I took the file to Don Ernesto, and he ran it through a spectrum analyzer. He pointed at a pattern in the waveform and said he could not explain why my name showed up in the same frequencies as the radio interference. He was not the kind to speculate, but he also said he had seen anomalies before that were not technical in nature. We compared frequency bands and matched the odd file to the night at the station and the night in the cab and found overlapping signatures that should not logically align because the devices were different and the inputs were not shared. Those technical details are not meant to convince the skeptical so much as to show that I did not keep these things in a drawer called imagination. The aftermath of these nights really changed my life in small, practical ways. I started to leave my lantern turned on at the station during breaks. I asked for shifts earlier in the night whenever possible. I began wearing the small silver locket my mother gave me and carrying a bead of rosary my neighbor Carlos gifted, even though I am not a man of strong prayer. I stopped taking fares to certain neighborhoods, and I asked my friend Marco to share notes about odd writers. I lost a portion of my sleep pattern and gained a list of people who would nod and say, "I understand," in the back of a voice. The community response was peculiar. Some neighbors closed curtains and pretended they had never seen the car at Pump 3. Others sat me down and told me about road legends with a hush and an anxious pride. Linda stopped scheduling double nights for me and offered me part-time day work, but the nights had a gravity I could not shake, so sometimes I returned. The sense of being followed did not disappear. It thinned into a presence that liked to show up at thresholds and in reflective surfaces. There were small physical consequences, too. I lost weight because my stomach tightened nightly, and I began to notice my hands shook when I was alone. But the scariest consequence was not physical. It was the knowledge that the world had more holes than I had thought, and that some of those holes had voices that knew my name. I will be honest about the fear. And
the moments of doubt. There were nights I thought I had imagined everything after too many cups of coffee. There were times I questioned sanity because how else did you explain the precise knocks that matched my name? I visited a therapist for a short time, and she helped me catalog the events and the triggers and gave me breathing exercises that made the nights less sharp. Some nights, the ritual of writing down times and names calmed me as much as any other practice. I kept a list of names and little notes about what each person had seen or felt. It reads like an unofficial roster of witnesses. Linda gas station owner saw the car at pump 3 and heard the knock on the metal locker. Mike, my friend and ex-coworker, watched the footage and later admitted he had seen a shadow in his truck at night. Rosa, my ex-wife, came to the station with coffee and felt a pressure against the counter like a palm on the wood. Marco, the dispatcher, had another driver report a fare who vanished near the cemetery. Don Ernesto, the CCTV tech, created a forensic copy and left a voicemail telling me to be careful. Sarah, the nurse, heard the laugh in the hospital corridor, and Father Miguel, the chaplain, came with a candle and said some places keep memory. Hector, maintenance, checked the hinges and found nothing wrong. Carlos, the neighbor, touched the hood and said the metal was cold in a way that did not make sense. Officer Ramirez filed the police report and later admitted he had felt uneasy while walking the parking lot. Those names anchor the story because these are the people who turned my private fear into a public pattern. The moments of tension I carry are specific and tight like knotted ropes. One such moment occurred when I sat alone in the station office and the CCTV feed went black for exactly 38 seconds and then came back, revealing a smear on the screen that looked like a handprint but was not human skin. In my mind, I replayed it, and the memory pressed the inside of my skull with a physical ache. I remember thinking, this is the part where you run, and this is the part where you call someone. And then I did both. I ran out to the pumps with my flashlight, and I called Mike, and he came within 15 minutes, and we stood in the white glare of the sodium lights and said little sentences that tried to convert the event into something manageable. Another moment of tension was the night in the hospital when I pushed the supply closet door open and the chair rolled forward toward me with the slow inevitability of tide water, and the blanket on it bore an imprint like a sleeping shoulder. I remember backing away and feeling the floor shift under me in a way that had... Another procedure at the hospital recorded by Hector described sensor baseline resets and decibel mapping, which amounted to tagging motion sensor logs, measuring ambient noise over 3 shifts, and cross-referencing staff keycard entries. Those technical notes are dull on the surface, but they show the seriousness we apply to strange things, because without records, the story dissolves into rumor. The epilogue is a long and living thing that I will tell you in 3 parts, because time changes how you understand fear. 1 month after the events, I kept my silver locket glued to my shirt, and I had lost a visible layer of ease. I took extra shifts in the day so I could avoid the parkway where I had once dropped passengers. My hands trembled while I refilled coffee, and sometimes I imagined that static in the radio was answering me. Linda asked if I wanted a different position, and I said no, though I meant maybe. People in the neighborhood started asking if I wanted to move my things inside at night, and one woman offered to take in my laundry because she said she did not like that light at pump 3 either. In that first month, I received 2 anonymous notes left on my car with the words "Stay awake" and "Be careful," and a dried violet pressed between the pages. I kept the notes in a drawer and I looked at them like warnings and like heirlooms. That first month, I walked the property at dusk and early dawn, and I learned which shadows are safe and which press like questions into your throat. I slept with a lamp on and woke easily until the habit became muscle memory, and then a small fatigue settled like dust. 3 months later, I had changed enough that habits looked different, but the memory had settled into a calmer dread. I no longer jumped at every creek, though I sometimes caught myself counting the pumps when I drove by. The police file grew a little fat with interviews as other drivers and nurses remembered odd details. The hospital held a night safety meeting and they increased lighting in certain corridors and installed an additional motion sensor. I took photos of the modified lights and wrote them into my log. Father Miguel visited the station and blessed the pumps in a short ceremony that involved a small cup of water and quiet words. He did not promise answers and he did not pretend to. He offered a ritual more than a solution, and that mattered to some of us. Don Ernesto called to say the forensic lab had nothing to contradict the footage we had, and that the waveform anomalies remained unexplained. He sounded tired and careful with his words, and I could hear the machines hum in the background of his voice. I resumed taking a few night shifts because fear is a bad accountant and curiosity is a worse investor. And the truth is, I wanted to know whether the presence would appear if I tried to meet it with a pen and paper. By the 3-month mark, I had started to write small pieces about what happened, and I shared them with a few friends who nodded and said, "You turned it into a craft, turning fear into a record." 6 months on, I had changed more deeply. I had moved some of my possessions away from the house closest to the station, and I had a steady day roll at a supply company, though I still picked up night work sometimes. The presence had not followed me consistently, and yet, occasionally at 3 in the morning, my phone would receive a silent call with no number, and my radio would pick up a wave of static like a reminder. I kept the little locket, and I carried an old rosary from Carlos, and I stopped asking people to prove my memory, because memory was no longer the only record. The files and the cameras existed now. I found comfort in the idea that the community recognized the oddity and that names like Linda and Marco had persisted in the log. I stopped pretending I knew the rules and I learned to respect them. At 6 months, I met with Officer Ramirez again, and he said he had taken an interest in similar calls across the county and that he was collecting them quietly. He did not say much, but his tone suggested that what he had thought was isolated now looked like a pattern. I kept writing in the duty log because it felt like leaving breadcrumbs, and I started to plan a small archive for the files just in case more people came forward. In closing, I want to be clear about what changed and what did not. I am still Daniel Ortiz. I still work sometimes at night because that is the life I know and because some truths compel you to keep watching. The evidence I collected exists in files and in the memories of Linda, Mike, Rosa, Marco, Don Ernesto, Sarah, Father Miguel, Hector, Carlos, and Officer Ramirez. You can choose to believe it or to explain it away with coincidence and season. I will not force your hand. But if you walk past a pump at night and a car sits there with lights on and no driver in the seat, do not assume you know why. Check your reflection in the glass, listen for a knock that might be your name, and if you hear something, leave a note in the log as I did. I do not know whether these things are spirits or physics or a human sleepwalking in the world between stations and hospital corridors and cemetery roads. I do know this: whatever it is, it keeps pattern and it learns to be patient. If you want to know more, I will keep sharing what I find, and I will keep listening for dispatch. If you felt chills while I told this, please consider subscribing so we can collect more of these reports and keep a record for those who work when the city sleeps. Tell me in the comments, in my shift and the place where it happened, so we can build a map of nights together. And remember, if you ever see a car with lights on and no one behind the wheel, do not assume the light is empty. Sometimes it is only waiting for you to notice.